right, welcome to today's episode of Tomorrow's Leader, where we dive deep on all things leadership, how to lead yourself better and lead others. As you just heard, I've got a great guest here for you, Jim Simpson. Jim, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show. This is part two, so great to have you again.
Thanks. I am happy to be here. We had a lot of fun last time. So,
We did, yeah, and that's why I figured let's get even deeper and let's talk even more than just a quick little 10 minutes. So, a lot to share with the audience. I would love to go back to you are this leader today, but I really want to start with kind of as you look back in your life, and I know you had a lot of interesting experiences as a kid. Were there things you look back on now that you say, wow, this was a really cool thing? I didn't know it at the time, but it shaped who I am and it impacted who I am as a leader?
yeah, there's two things that come to mind immediately. I'm what they call a military brat. So my father was in the military, and what that means is I moved a lot as a kid, and there are pros and cons to that. You can ask my mother, who had to pack up the house over and over again. But one of the really great things that came out of it is, just the reintroduction or introducing different environments over and over again and having to learn to become adaptable to them and having that be a way of life versus something that's unusual. And in particular, we moved to Japan when I was young, and I did most of my formative years in high school living in Japan. And one of the interesting things about their society is, number one, there's a lot less violence in it. There's a lot more group focus, and there's a lot more thought given towards like how do we all get along together and help each other. And I'm generalizing, so every society has its challenges, but like in particular, one of the things that really stood out in my mind was the fact that my parents gave me a lot more autonomy than I might have had otherwise. So the ability to take risks, go on adventures, and kind of make my own life. And that really stood out to me when I came back to the States. And, I started meeting my peers in the States, and I was finding that while like we were, intellectually at the same level and, smart, I had a lot more ability in terms of like being able to go out there and just sort of live and be a part of the world because I'd had that opportunity when I was growing up.
It's got to give you a lot of confidence, right? I mean, I'm just thinking all that kind of stepping outside your comfort zone. That can't be, as an 11-year-old kid going to Japan, comfortable. I mean, you didn't know the language. You're really going into, a unusual situation.
Yeah, there is some confidence. There's also like, having the people to help you see the opportunity. So one of the things my father said over and over again was bloom where you're planted. It's like you don't have a choice in this. So try to seize the opportunity. And like I have a younger sister, and we actually had very different, outcomes because of these experiences. She was not as interested in like, seeing the opportunity, whereas I was like, oh my gosh, like I guess I don't speak the language, but I'm going to go outside and like run around and play with the other kids. And, I learned the language and became bilingual. But I'll tell you, the first things I learned were, swear words and how to buy candy and things like that. All of the things
All
that
the
are really
essentials.
important to kids. Yes. Right. But like that, being able to do that and being included, like, because I was, making friends in spite of some of the challenges I had. Yeah, I guess that was very, very confidence and
Yeah.
inspiring in a way.
So and it's interesting because I think about that a lot, and I was not a military kid, but I moved 30 times in my life at least. I mean, crazy amounts.
Yep.
And I look back on that at the time. I hated it. I thought it was the worst thing in the world, but I look, and it did, to your point, teach me how to be adaptable. It taught me how to step outside my comfort zone and approach people. And you were saying this earlier when we talked about how people are pretty much the same. I mean, people all kind of have the same fears, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So when I came back from Japan, my cousin Kim was a counselor for something the Red Cross used to run. I don't know if they do anymore. It was called LDC. It was like a leadership development camp, and they would take people up into the California teenagers up into the California mountains for about a week throughout the summer. And I was a little bit nervous about participating in this, and she gave me this advice where she was like, look, nobody knows who you are. So you could actually be anybody you wanted to be. And to me, that seemed like a little bit like, I'm like, what is she talking about? Like my brand is like, I'm like the smart computer kid. I like playing video games. I don't have a whole lot of friends, but I'm a nice person. But again, I was like, well, I don't know, maybe I'll play around with this. And she was right, because everyone else was approaching it from the same perspective. Everyone was kind of shy going into it. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to try this out. And I was like, I'm going to start saying hi to people, introducing myself, and like going out of my comfort zone, because what do I have to lose? I'll never see these people again. But what I gained from that was like 30 people who I still know to this day. And a lot of it was, I remember seeing in their face the gratitude of like, I'm so glad someone's talking to me right now and I'm not alone. And I was just sort of like, this is a really powerful thing to like make that first move, to take initiative. And like, I felt like I'd found some sort of secret, because I was like, well, I thought I was the lowest common denominator, but here I am. And by the end of that camp, I'd found myself kind of in the center of a lot of the people that came up there. And I was like, oh, okay, well, isn't that unusual? I wonder, does anybody else know this? And when I went to college, the same exact thing happened. I had a lot of friends on my hall in the dorm, or a lot of guys on in the hall of my dorm, and like, again, I noticed the same thing. People were intimidated, and I was like looking around. I'm like, these are like people who probably were really cool when they were in high school or something, but for whatever reason they're really shy now. So I'm just gonna go say hi and see what happens. And it was the same thing. And like having that proven out twice in a very short period of time to me, I was like, okay, something about taking initiative is like really important for like life. So I'm going to do more of that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, and you make me think of a bunch of things, and you're right. Initiative is one of them, and that's influence, right? You're helping somebody do something that they might not have otherwise done, which is become part of a group, become more included, and feeling included, and be more comfortable with something that's uncomfortable. So was that a point where you kind of started to view yourself more as a leader? Was that the point, or was there another point where you kind of looked and said, hey, I think this is a direction I'm really good at?
Yeah, I wish I could say so. I was taking an online quiz and it said you're a leader, but no, it was more like, an iterative process where um I by default, I think also because of growing up in Japan, I try to think more about the group or the team. And, even though I am the leader, I still want to be approachable. And so it wasn't until, a bit later in my career when I began to notice that, like, when I saw a vacuum, you know, complaining about like a need, like, oh, this thing isn't happening in the company, or we're not working on this feature for this project, or like this person isn't doing this thing. I noticed that like identifying it alone was not going to actually solve the problem. And maybe it was somebody else's responsibility. However, filling that need or stepping up and doing something about it is, what made the difference. And the other part about it was the recognition that sometimes people didn't realize or didn't see it the same way. And that's when I began to think, well, maybe this is actually like a skill set or something that's different about me, or something that I can help other people with, or model to other people. And it really was, the first time I became a manager that, you know, I had the opportunity to try some of it out more officially and see. And you know, there's a lot of different ideas about how people should manage. And, in my career, I'd been given feedback like, you need to be more of a leader, which always kind of was gutting. And I was like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, and what the feedback really was there is they wanted me to be a leader that directed people. Whereas I always felt my leadership style was more like pushing people forward and trying to figure out like where their strengths were, what things they could grow in, and then what things we should never have them do, which was a lot less about telling people what to do and like how they should think, and more about like trying to figure out like what makes them tick, what motivates them. And that's when I was like, okay, this is the thing. But I don't think that that's always rewarded in corporate America, at least in my experience, because I watched other people go the other route and everyone's like, oh, that person's like really decisive and great, and like let's promote them. And meanwhile, I'm like, well, I have like the most reliable team. Like, how do I get ahead? But it just took me a little bit longer and a different route to get here. But when I look at my team, I know that they feel empowered as to what they're doing, and that this is a way of being a leader that and I'm sure someone's written about this, because like some of my leadership stuff I've discovered on my own, but half the time when you're a leader, you're like, oh, someone like really important wrote a book about that 30 years ago. I just didn't have to read it yet. So
Right, right, exactly. Never ending journey of reading. Is it do you figure out, because I think a lot of people struggle with this as leaders, trying to figure out, not to sound too philosophical, but who they are, as a leader, like, okay, this is who I'm comfortable being. I think there's a lot of effort sometimes to try to anticipate what type of leader you should be in a situation and adapt to be that. And we forget sometimes to be ourselves. Um, do you get to a point where you figure out, hey, okay, I'm rock solid. I know who I am. I know what I'm going to do. Or is it just this never ending journey to kind of constantly try and figure yourself out?
I think that we're always evolving. And I know that sounds like a cop out of an answer, but in my career, when I've thought about like moving into management and leadership and what have you, I was like, oh, okay, once I'm the manager, then everything will be great. Nope, there's still challenges. Once I'm the director and I have managers, then it'll be great. Nope. Once I'm the VP, nope. I'm the CEO now, and there's still things that I'm learning about myself. But what I will say is that things, like I've really tried to pay attention to the things that have positive outcomes for both me and the people around me and do more of those things. And so there's sometimes I've done things that they didn't like work out so great, but um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that like it's just a continual process, and you you have to be paying attention. And I feel pretty strongly about like who I am and where I am right now, but I'm always open to figuring out like, well, are there things I should be doing differently? And I think long story short, like even when you become the CEO, there's still like a little bit of like, hey, am I doing all the right things?
Mm-hmm.
Is this the way I should be? And people externally have said, yes, you're doing great.
Yeah.
So do more of
Yeah.
what you're doing. So like I think it's important to be reflective, even if you have like sort of solidified in many ways and into a point of leadership.
Well, and I think a part of it also goes back to what you said earlier, in that everybody has fears, and oftentimes it's the same fears. As a kid, maybe it's somewhat different as an adult, but probably not too much. And I find it very interesting and also, comforting that as I talk to leaders, and some leaders of very large organizations, if they're candid and open, they'll share, what, they actually do have the same fears. I had a very interesting conversation with a leader last week who had said that he was feeling like, hey, I don't think I'm the best person for this. I'm not necessarily the most qualified person. And it wasn't necessarily a lack of confidence in him being able to do it, but it was an awareness that, hey, listen, there are people that could do this better. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. There's a reason for me and a need for me to hire people around me that are great, and that's what he's done. That filled some of the gaps that I have. So I think that humility is important as a leader too.
Yeah, self-awareness. I think you hit the nail right on the head there. And like when I think back sometimes in my career, there were points where I was disappointed, like, oh, I didn't get that job, or that person was my manager and I don't think they were the right person. Being able to go back and go, actually, there's a reason why that didn't happen for me. And that person was actually a good leader for me. Um, when you can sort of figure that out, it gets a lot easier, because then you're like seeking to like figure out like, hey, what am I doing great? What can I do better? There's that line about, like the teacher only appears when the student is ready. There's some truth to that. We can read that and go, oh my gosh, yeah, that makes so much sense, and I'm ready. But sometimes we're not. But I think things, accelerated for me when there was a point at which I was like, okay, so these things haven't happened. What can I do? How can I get better? And what is the critical feedback that I need to hear to move ahead? And whether or not it's true, like going through the process of like being able to hear that feedback, assess it, and then decide what you want to do next is, I think the part that really made a difference for me.
Yeah, without a doubt. When you look back, were there um, times where you felt like you just you made some mistakes, you did some things where you're like, geez, you look back now and you're like, that was a big, big learning. Any things that you're willing to share with the audience? Because I think that's always helpful for people to hear and see a successful leader really doing great, but look back and say, hey, yeah, there were some things I missed.
I think, so to go back to something I said earlier was, I spent my career working in early stage startups, and it's not always obvious, like, why things happen when you are an IC or you're a first line manager, right? Like, management might make a decision and you're like, well, that's crazy. And I think that I've heard leaders phrase this different ways. One of the ways that we've phrased this at a company I worked at called Duo Security was like, you need to assume positive intent. And that can be a problematic phrase. I want to acknowledge that up front. But the idea there is sometimes things are happening that you're not aware of. And so, like, I think back on times when, like, I had a perspective on something, but I didn't have the full context of why that happened. And I spoke up and said, oh, this is, a bad idea. And why are we doing this? And really what was happening in that moment was I was sort of removing myself from people's ideas of a future leader because I wasn't taking the time to try and figure out why that thing was happening. I was just jumping to a conclusion. And so, like, there are many times when I have done this in my career, and if you talk to some of the people who've been there along the way, they might characterize it as like, Jim has been emotional in his career, and that's true. And I think that's actually an asset. But like for me, it's been learning about like, well, when is it appropriate to like lean into emotion? Like it's having an EQ is a really critical thing as a leader, but it's like that can also be used in unfortunate ways. And, I think probably the other thing that has helped me with that is a lot of training, like on bias and like understanding like how you're communicating. And I think it's like the concerns I had that might have, slowed me down a bit in the past might have been valid, but I probably could have like approached it so differently. And I really wish I could go back and be like, hey, calm down, like give it a night or two, then come back to it, and or try and put yourself in other people's positions to think about like why that might happen. Or here's the best one that like we might not don't do anything. Like sometimes the best thing is to do nothing and just let somebody else solve the problem that you perceive. So
Mm-hmm.
like those are the things that I when I reflect on my career, but it's become more abstract, especially the farther I get away from some of it. So
Yeah, that's interesting, really interesting. And you're right. There sometimes the best decision is to decide to do nothing. That is a decision in of itself. To go back to the emotions, is there a time where, because this is also a really tough thing for leaders, because a lot of times leaders of organizations are emotional. They're very passionate. They've got a lot of conviction, confidence, whatever. They're just a lot of emotions that do come out. Is that bad? Is it good? I mean, is there a time, for example, when a leader should display anger? Is that not really the place in a company environment? I mean, what's your thought on that?
yeah, so anger, I mean, I think anger is like I'm gonna split hairs here. I think it's okay to express frustration because you can talk about frustration a bit more objectively. I think expressing anger is really dangerous because it can be misinterpreted, and so you have to be like thoughtful about that. With somebody, and I think the further you get up in the leadership chain, the more thoughtful you have to be about frustration because you're modeling certain behavior, and the more constructive we can be about situations that might frustrate us or make us angry, the better off people are. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what I think about a lot, because there have been points when I've been angry and it's like, I have a former COO I worked for. He was like, I know something's going on inside of your head right now, but you are so cool, calm, and collected on the outside. And what was awesome was like, and he was right because I was like raging out on the inside, and I'm like, this is good. This is good. I'm keeping it in. I've finally made progress on this part of myself. But
Yeah.
I'll give you a counter example, like a really, not recent one, but it happened, pre-pandemic when I was working at my last company, and um, my manager had convened a group of us together across our department. We were the product department, so it was like product managers, product marketing people, and we'd been acquired by Cisco. And the product marketing team had worked really hard to come up with a launch plan for the next year. And it, things had changed, but it wasn't entirely obvious to all of us like how much things had changed since the acquisition. And my manager basically said, "Yeah, we're not doing any of that." Like sort of like glossing over the details, but the outcome of that was a lot of the people on the product marketing team, you could just see how crestfallen they were, and it made me angry. And that was a moment where I wish I could take it back, because I like unleashed. And um the product marketers, all privately, they're like, "Yeah, thank you for standing up for us. Yeah, like, that's so frustrating. Like, we worked so hard on this. We worked on this for months, and like he just like pulls the plug in like one meeting." Well, as you might imagine, that did not what ends, like that for me. Like, I had a conversation with my manager very shortly thereafter, and he was like, "That's the first time I've ever been scared in a meeting. And I don't know what happened, because you've never displayed that behavior before." And we talked about it a bit, and I walked him through it, and he was like, "Look, let me tell you something. Like, don't do that again, because you have so much potential and capability. That is definitely not the hill worth dying on. And like, here's why it is." And it led to a different conversation about like how he could be a better communicator, because he knew all of these things that were going on, but he hadn't made those manifest to the rest of the team. And so it improved our relationship, but I probably could have gone about that totally differently. And from then on forward, I was like, "Well, I'm never going to do that again. If I ever get angry like that, I won't do anything about it. I'll write it down, and then I'll look at it the next day and see what like constructive steps I can take to improve the situation." Because I could have, had a meeting with him the next day where I said, "Hey, do you know how frustrated the product marketing team is, having worked on that for 3 months? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how can we make this better?" Instead, I kind of died on the hill, and the big
Mm.
spectacular explosion that was really dramatic and entertaining, but sometimes entertainment is not what we're going for in the corporate office.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And that's great that you had somebody that could have that conversation with you. And that was a really great development moment for you. I mean, I think a lot of people, and you see it in, on TV and movies all the time, the boss that comes in that's, barking and, flying off the handle and stuff. And you almost get trained. I remember as a kid starting in corporate America, thinking that that's how a leader was. And I actually had my first leader was exactly like a character out of a movie. So I was thinking, okay, well, that's got to be how everybody is that's successful. And he was successful, which made it even
Yeah.
almost worse. So it's really important though. And you bring up a good point. It's like that fear that's evoked in people is really just, it's then manifests into distrust and insecurity and lack of willing to take risks and chances when their boss is somebody that flies off the handle. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to have that reaction. And so it's really interesting. I want to go back to something you said earlier, which I thought was really great. And that's, assuming positive intent.
Mhm.
I find a lot of times there are situations in organizations that are very misinterpreted. There's decisions that people don't understand the rationale for, and there's a very good reason for a decision, but that reason was not communicated. And because of that, in the absence of an explanation or information, people make up their own narrative. They make up their own stuff, and oftentimes it's totally, totally wrong. Um,
Mhm.
how should leaders, how do they become aware of that or be more conscious of that? I mean, that's a problem. And I've seen it, and I've saw it just happen very recently with a major decision that was poorly communicated. And so it trickled down through the organization and it was a mess. What steps should leaders take to make sure that's not the case?
There's a couple of tools I keep on hand. The first is that, when we discover such things, or something bad happens, or like people are dissatisfied with an outcome, we almost always do a retro on it. We get somebody to get together to like, talk through it so we can understand like, well, this thing happened, it was bad, like what can we do to make it better? And a lot of times it is communication that comes out of that, and like who needs to be who needs to know and when they need to know. And when you're in a startup, those dynamics shift all the time. And so, you know we have to like help people understand that like as we evolve the company, things are going to be changing, and we also have to be prepared for the fact that not everybody's going to know everything. So how do we build processes in place to overcome that? The second thing that I do is I try to have touch points in the organization with a variety of people. So I don't just talk to my direct line, like I'm talking to them. I'm also spot checking by communicating with ICs throughout the organization, really to find out like, hey, like what's your understanding on this? What do you think of this? We've also created like an anonymous question forum in which anybody can ask any question about anything. And what's interesting to me about that is, that was a holdover from Duo, and at Duo there was always like a bunch of questions going into that, and uh, mad props to the comms team for always going through those and finding ways to make them more presentable to the rest of the team, because what came into those forums sometimes was not what was got presented on stage, because I got to see them myself every once in a while when one of them pertained to stuff I did. And what I think is interesting about where I work now is like we try to be so transparent and over communicate. We don't get a lot of anonymous questions. And I think that's actually an indicator that people are getting the information that they need. So it's another way of kind of like spot checking like what's going on here. The other thing that I do is I make myself available to anybody, and I do that by blocking out time on my calendar every other week where anybody can come and ask me anything about the company. And I haven't gotten a topic yet where I've been like, oh, I don't want to tell you about this, and I'm waiting for that moment. But most of the time I'm like, oh, you know what? You should have known about this. And I'm sorry you didn't know about this. Let me figure out how we're going to communicate this better in the future. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the things, that we're doing to try to make sure that people do get the information that they need. The other thing that is important is, especially in hybrid or 100% work environments, is really to try and find ways to get people together so that they can build empathy and trust with each other, because it's really hard to do it when you're sitting behind Zoom screens. Even if you see that person all the time, it's amazing what can happen when you have a couple of people play a silly game in a room together, who haven't had the chance to see each other in like 6 months. Like, you come out of that and all of a sudden all sorts of problems get solved much more quickly. So those are some of the things that, we think about and try to deploy to help with that.
I love that. That's such good insight. I know, and I know we're running a little short of time. There's so many more things I want to ask you, but let's talk about Blumira. Share with the audience a little bit, and I know we've got it. We'll put it in the show notes, and we've got it a little bit in the intro there. But tell them a little bit about the company. It's done really, really well, grown fast under your leadership. Tell them a little bit about it.
Sure. So, what we're doing is helping small and medium-sized businesses solve for breach. So when companies get breached, it can be really hard to determine when they've been breached. On average, it's over 280 days for a company to discover that. And unfortunately, the only tools that are out there right now are really geared towards companies with really large budgets. So no one's helping or looking out for the little guy. And so that's what we do. And everything starts with culture. So if we focus on building a good culture in the company, I know that that's going to result in us building a good product, because if we center our people will center our customers. And if we center our customers, we'll solve real problems. And it makes it that much easier to, sell a product, create like a positive feedback loop where happy customers are happy to buy our product, which means that we can hire more people, build more culture, do more cool things. So that's a little bit about what Blumira is. We're technically based in Southeast Michigan, but 100% remote work, which is, got pros and cons, but we're navigating through it like the rest of the world is.
Excellent. Well, I know that's first of all a huge value and what you do. I know the issue is significant. I just was talking to a company that's going through that right now, a very serious issue, and alarming that you say that it's typically 280 days before somebody even realizes there's been a breach. I would have said 7 days, maybe. That's amazing.
I should have asked you, because most of the time, I got to tell you, when I ask people, they guess 14 days. So that's kind of the median. So what I would say, that tells me you're a very optimistic fellow, and I like that a lot. But it's not when it
Well,
comes to breach.
optimism or naive, one or the other. I don't know, somewhere in the middle. Fascinating stuff. So we'll put all that in the show notes, Jim, for all the listeners as well. If they want to get a hold of you or learn more about Blumira, what's the best place for them to do that?
Easiest thing to do is go to blumira.com, blumira.com, and you can sign up for a free trial there. And rest assured, I am staring at everything. So if you come our way, I will find you on the other side.
Awesome. I love it. Well, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for sharing some wisdom. I love your story. I love the things that you're doing. No surprise you're having the success you're having. And I'm looking forward to hearing what's going on in the future. So keep us up to date.
You're welcome, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. We've been here with Jim Simpson, who's the CEO of Blumira. Check him out for sure. Go to the website. We'll have all that in the links. Appreciate you joining us today. As always, like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. Go down below, give a 5-star review, and we will see you next time. Take care.